Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for our presentation of Missouri Myths and Legends. I am Kat Stone Underwood, and I'm a librarian here at the Columbia Public Library. This program is part of our summer reading for 2021, Tales and Tales. We are nearing the end of summer reading, and so I'm going to go ahead and remind everyone to pick up your finishing prizes if you've finished and have not picked them up already. Make sure you fill out the finishing form as well, so you'll be entered to win some of the bigger prizes. And so if you have any questions, you can learn more at the library's website, dbrl.org. You can also give us a call or stop by, and we're happy to help you out with that and answer any questions you might have. A little bit of light housekeeping before we begin. So only the presenter and myself will be able to use our microphones. Everyone else is muted to cut down on background noise. If you have a question, you can feel free to type it into the chat. Both Mary and I will be able to see that, and I think our plan is to answer questions as they come in as we're able. So feel free to type in those questions as you have them. And then this discussion is going to be recorded, and it'll be available soon on the library's YouTube channel. And so now I'll go ahead and introduce our presenter, Mary Barile. For more than 20 years, Mary Barile has explored and shared Missouri legends, hauntings, and myths with audiences throughout the state. Mary earned her doctorate in theater from MU and works with universities, cities, and organizations to develop plays based on local history and folklore. She received the Missouri Humanities Council Award for Community Engagement and founded the MO-HIP Theater, which is History and Performance, with the State Historical Society. From the spooky to the amazing, Missouri stories tell us about our lives, our hopes, and our humor. Join us tonight to share some of the more unusual tales. And so now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mary.
Here I am as soon as I can. Here we go. Okay, I can't see anybody, right? I don't see anybody. Is that how that works?
Correct.
Oh,
Yep.
that's a shame. I don't get to see anybody. Okay, well, hi, everybody, whoever's there. Thank you for joining us. This is a lot of fun for me. Thank you for putting up with Zoom. I do appreciate that. And I haven't used it for a few weeks, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to screw something up as we go along. Tonight we're going to be, let me get the, well, I can't do that, can I? Okay, never mind. Tonight we're going to be talking about some unusual legends and stories and tales. And the difference is a legend is usually based in fact. There's some fact, there could be some fiction associated with it. It could be about a famous person, not a famous person, but it's a story a lot of people know. Johnny Appleseed, for one. A myth usually has to do with a hero, a god, something that's super or paranormal. And we have both myths, we have legends, we have tales, which is another, they can be fictional, they can be true. It really goes right across what Missouri offers us as far as stories go. Some of what we're going to look at tonight are some fun ones I think people don't know a lot about from across the state. And again, Kat, I can't see the chat things here, so if somebody does ask a question, just yell at me. And please feel free to ask questions if we go along. So if you're bored, I can't tell. I hope you're not. So we'll go from here. We're going to start with one of my favorite Missouri legends, is Dr. Joseph Nash McDowell. He was also known as Old Sawbones. He was born in Kentucky and received his degree from Transylvania University, which was one of the big medical schools, predated MU's, by the way, not by much. And he came up to St. Louis, where he was very well known as an eccentric individual, brilliant surgeon, and he treated everybody. He treated, at that time, which was unheard of, he treated slaves, he treated poor, he treated well-to-do people, and he did it all the way during the Civil War, even though he was a Southern sympathizer. He started a hospital in St. Louis And he was well known for marching along the ramparts of the hospital. It looked a little bit like a castle, dressed in armor and with cannons lining the edges. He didn't like the Jesuits, and the Jesuits were right across the road. And they also had a medical school. So he thought it was appropriate that he just keep them in line that way. McDowell was known as what we call a resurrectionist. And as I said, not seeing you, I can't tell if anybody knows what that is. Sometimes we call them grave robbers. At the time McDowell lived and worked in St. Louis, starting in the 1830s and going well until past the Civil War, you couldn't get bodies. You could go to medical school and you did not touch a body the entire time you were through medical school. You may have watched an autopsy, but you didn't necessarily learn to do it. McDowell believed that his students should. So what he did was he would keep an ear to the ground and hear when somebody who body was not claimed, it may have been a criminal, may have been someone who died in a gunfight or a sword fight or stabbing on the riverfront. St. Louis was a very rough town. And he would take his medical students and they would go into the cemeteries, they would dig up the body and they would bring it back to the hospital and they would do autopsies. Of course, this wasn't really popular with the people in St. Louis. And McDowell was, again, very well known. He loved to drink. He was terrified of thunderstorms. So his students used to like hide in the graves and jump up at him. So this must have been a really raucous kind of a group when they were learning about medicine. However, he did advance knowledge. One day, though, they did take a body back, and the family heard about this. It was a young woman. Excuse my dogs, I'm sorry. And he was warned. He was at the hospital with the body, and someone came in and told him that a mob was coming. It was a lynch mob. He was trapped. There was nowhere to leave. There was only one door in and out that would have gotten him past the mob. So he always told the story that the body was in the autopsy room and it was covered. And he started to go up the stairs. He didn't know where else to go. And on the steps, he saw the ghost of his mother standing there. And she held her hand up and then pointed in back of him. And he caught on. He got onto one of the autopsy tables and put a sheet over him. Well, the mob came in looking for him. Nobody liked bodies in those days. And they went by. He was saved. He always said he was saved by the ghost of his mother. And he went on again to teach well into, believe into the 1870s. I believe he went back to Kentucky towards the end of his life. But even the MU Medical School, there are records there of letters indicating that the only way you could get a body was to purchase it, again, usually from prisons or from hospitals where it was unclaimed. So McDowell was, in fact, McDowell was also the person who put the bodies in the cave. If any of you are Mark Twain fans, and you remember in Tom Sawyer, that they go into this Tom Sawyer cave and there's the body of a girl in a tube. It's believed that that was McDowell's either daughter who died very young or a niece. And he was studying the effects of pressure and air on decomposition. He was very much ahead of his time, but you can imagine how he was not particularly the person you would invite to a tea party in the 1840s. But he's one of our really great legends. This is an interesting piece. This is called Mort Safe, Mortsafe. You can see the bands around it. This is John Sappington's grave over towards Arrow Rock. And because of people like McDowell, safes like this where you would put the coffin in it and then you would seal it with the metal. And that way, hopefully the grave robbers could not get into it. But you can find these throughout Missouri. Okay. Our next legend is a musical one. Those of you who live in Columbia, if you haven't been to Blind Boone, John Blind Boone's grave, you should. Here it is. It's in the Columbia Cemetery right off Broadway. Boone was, of course, not, he's known for ragtime, but he was more of a classical composer. That's what he wanted to be remembered as. He was a genius. He was one of the most famous performers of his era. Unfortunately, for many years, he was nearly forgotten. That's slowly changing as people reclaim the history of Black music in Missouri. And of course, Boone was one of the leaders. His piano ended up at one of the grammar schools. He donated it to one of the grammar schools. I believe there are two of his pianos now in Columbia. And this was the one that is now at the Columbia Historical Society. You can go over and see it and hear it played. He had given it to one of the schools, and people would say that on a summer's night, you could hear music coming from the school. And there was always a story that this was Blind Boone came back to play his piano. And it's a lovely story. It's a lovely legend. We have a true person who did play piano, but are we actually hearing something, or was it just wistfulness? Until I was speaking to a group of people, and a woman brought up her quite elderly mother and introduced me. And her elderly mother told me that when she was a little girl, she and her mother would walk up to the school and stand there, and they could always hear the music on Blind Boone's piano. And I said, "How did you know that it was him?" And she goes, "Nobody plays like Boone." And I always thought that's a wonderful legend, because here I had confirmation of someone hearing this music, which was very difficult to play. So if you get a chance, stop by one of the schools on a summer's night, or maybe the Boone County Historical Society, and see if you can hear the piano, because I'm pretty sure Blind Boone comes back and visits once in a while. Some of our legends have to do with ghosts, one of my favorite areas, but I didn't want to just do all ghosts tonight. However, we have one of the more interesting hauntings in Missouri. I've only come across one other like it down in Virginia, and this is called the Clark's Fork Spook. And once again, I've spoken to people who said they ran into it and experienced it. Around the 1830s, a gentleman moved into the area south of Booneville around Clark's Fork and built a cabin near a spring. He lived there for a few years. He was kind of a hermit, but the gentlemen around town would stop by when they were going hunting and check in on him. And sometimes he'd go hunting with them. He had a dog, and And once they stopped in, and everything was okay in the cabin. Fire was on, door was open. The dog was missing, and so was the man. And he never came back. They searched. They never found a body. They don't know what happened. Eventually, the cabin fell into a room. So 1840s. Let's fast forward 90 years. When people around the region started to say that each year around November, where the cabin was, there was still ruins of the cabin, and this spring, the farms along the road said that they would see a light that would move up the road and go to the cabin and go from side to side looking through the windows. They didn't mind that. They got used to it, except every now and then the light would move through the forest, and you could hear, they said you could hear it like shouting and screaming and calling, like it was moving animals through, or dogs, or turkeys. And then it would shoot up a tree, and the tree would look like it was burning. And they'd go out the next day, and the tree was absolutely fine. So they saw this every year for decades. And eventually the spook, as it was known as, would start to bounce up the road towards some of the farms, much like the Joplin spook lights, if any of you have been down to that area. And it would come up the road, and one family told me, it was her grandfather. The grandfather told this individual that the spook would come up the road and would jump at the dogs. It loved to tease the dogs. And he said it was this huge ball of light. And what was eerie about it is they could hear somebody saying something, but they could never make out the words. And he saw it numerous times. People were used to it. Somewhere around World War II, he stopped showing up. We don't know what happened to it, but there were no more reports of it. There is a ghost very much like that down in Virginia, except this is called the Whirlaway Ghost. And he comes up from the water and goes up to a certain house. There were actually news stories about it in the 1920s. And the women were terrified in the house. They would hear thunking like somebody was walking very heavily along the path. And then they would see a face or a body moving from window to window. Same type of ghost, but we do have it down in Clark's Fork. And if you've ever been down there on a late summer's evening, you could really understand why people saw this. Okay, odd things. I love this photo. I took it out in Liberty at the, I think it wasn't the Masonic home. I can't think of which home it was, and the turkey buzzard. And he sat there for an hour. He was very happy. Now, some of our legends, which are quite fun. Tell me what time it is. Anybody know? I treat you like classes.
7:18.
Thank you. Thank you, Kat. Momo, how many, again, I wish I could see people. Momo showed up in the 1970s. And we have had several, those of you who are interested in Bigfoot, if you're aware of it, there is a Bigfoot reporting database that you can log into and look at Bigfoot sightings anywhere in the country. And yes, there have been some of them around Cooper County and Saline County and Boone County. Bigfoot is, as most of you would know, supposed to be very large, ape-like, humanoid. Nobody knows. It's like a Yeti up in the Himalayas. The Native Americans had the grass giant out in Ohio. I've seen reports from Kansas on the prairie, people saying they saw large humanoid creatures marching across the prairie in the 1870s. So we've always had this story, but in the 1970s, we had a really interesting one. It's called Momo because it's the Missouri monster, those of you who are not aware of this. And up in Louisiana, Missouri, apparently a young girl was in the house. She was babysitting and she looked out and here came this very large, she described it as like an ape-like creature. And what they always said was the smell was terrible. And she screamed, it ran, she called her mother, the police, the sheriff was there. They spent actually a good week searching for this. This is an example, this is a Bigfoot researcher from the 1970s and a sketch of what they thought Momo looked like. Nothing was found, although at least 3 other people reported running into it. One, it was crossing the road carrying a dead animal. Another one, it was looking in the window. And a third, it was standing in the yard. Legends can have we know it took place in Louisiana, Missouri. We know the people who reported it. There are names. You can look up newspaper articles, which are actually quite funny for the time. Very, very funny. Because they had Republicans and Democrats and they were running against each other in the they all went out to look for Momo. And there was a lot of jokes about that. But it only shows that the idea of this type of a creature is also found in a place like Missouri. Whether it's real or not, I can't tell you. The other one that's out towards St. Louis is called, I don't have a picture of it, a Piasaw bird, which was a Native American story. When people started to explore the bluffs along the Missouri River in the 1600s and such, they came across bones, of animals and mistook them for birds. And instead of saying this could have been a large bear that died 500 years ago and, we found it in a cave, what they chose to say was that it was a giant bird because people had reported seeing giant birds along the Missouri River, and Native Americans had some stories of pterodactyl-like creatures. Well, again, it's a legend, right? Maybe something large. There's a turkey buzzard, whatever. Except right around the same time, some young boys were playing in a yard in St. Louis at a birthday party, and the mother was there. And all of a sudden, there's this huge bird with his talons in the back of one of the boys' shirts, dragging the child across the lawn and actually lifting him up. Everybody screamed, whatever it was, dropped the boy. He was taken to the emergency room. They have records of his injuries, which were puncture injuries and scratches and such. He's still alive. He's told the story. He said he didn't see what it was. He just felt himself being lifted off the ground. Um, People have dismissed it as a condor, which we don't have in Missouri. An eagle is not going to lift a 10-year-old boy, 8-year-old boy. So some of these legends obviously go back hundreds of years, and they still crop up. And what I always have a talk with people about the paranormal or supernatural or things like this is that after you have about 500 people telling you they've seen something, you usually can get rid of 498. Oh, it could be this, that, or the, but there's always that 2 or 3% who you believe. What it is, I have no idea. I don't want to run into either one. It's just is kind of my guess. Okay. Any questions? I can't tell.
None have come through so far.
Either we're stunned with information or bored to death. I'm not sure which one it is. So I'll say you're stunned with information. Missouri was settled by the Europeans who came into Missouri. During the European settlement, of course, Native Americans. I have an Indian mound 2 houses up from me that probably is 1,500 years old in my neighbor's yard. But when Europeans came in, they brought a lot of their own beliefs. And many of the Europeans who came into this region were from Kentucky, were from North Carolina, from the southeastern United States. And a lot of them had English and Irish backgrounds. And those stories very often had gods and monsters. And a big one, of course, was witchcraft. Witchcraft beliefs were prevalent in the Ozarks well into the 1940s and 50s. And this had been passed down. One of the stories we have is a very interesting one. We know who this woman was, Prudence Bevis. Sometimes she was called Beavers, Bevers. She and her husband settled down north of St. Genevieve in the 1820s, and possibly a little bit earlier. We don't have the exact date that they moved in. She was the second wife of her husband. She was probably 20 years younger, and it's believed that she was Cherokee and Irish. And she was very independent. When her husband passed away, she ran his business and became fairly comfortable. But she didn't quite belong in the community. And she eventually did healing, natural healing. She may have, been a midwife and helped out. We don't know this, but we do know that she eventually was accused of witchcraft. It's interesting because there was a witchcraft outbreak of fear of witches that actually started with Native American tribes, because witchcraft can be very deep in a religious belief system. But this jumped then over into the European beliefs, and witchcraft started to gain traction. So Prudence was pretty by some accounts, independent, wealthy, younger than the husband. He died young. He was older than she was, but he died suddenly. So all this added up into the fact that, oh my goodness, she cured people with herbs. People start to call her a witch. Supposedly, a rabbit was shot at with a silver bullet. We all heard the silver bullets and witches or vampires or werewolves. And the rabbit got away, and the next day Prudence was seen limping. That's a very common story. People blame their missing cows on her. She was an easy target. Two men came along, which was interesting. Aaron Cook said that every time he'd fall asleep, Prudence would appear and turn him into a horse and ride him over the land to the barn of the Widerman family, and tie him up, and then she'd meet with her friends, and then she'd take him back home. This is called hag ridden. We still use that term. And Cook testified to this in court. Fortunately, nobody believed him. But it's interesting that we do have names that are associated with this. Usually with a legend, it's Jim Smith or a gentleman down the street or my third cousin, but to have actual names, Bevis and Cook and Weideman, is kind of interesting. Well, Prudence ignored it. She was smart. She didn't fight back. She didn't go to court. She just ignored it. She actually donated land and leased land to local churches. She would give money to schoolhouses, building the schoolhouses. She eventually moved into St. Louis, and around the Civil War, she passed away at an advanced age. But it's interesting that within that time period, she was considered a witch, Victoria witch, because the area she settled in was called Victoria at that time. Witchcraft in the Ozarks existed well into the 20th century. One of the stories I was told is it's called a mute supper, or where girls would get together. It was always young women, and they wanted to know who they were going to marry. This is very important at that time, 1920s, 1930s, very important. And what they would do is they would get together and they would make a supper, and they would not say a word while they were preparing it, but they would do everything backwards. They would turn their back to the table while they were setting it. The idea being that then they would sit down at the supper, and at midnight, they would see who they were going to marry in a mirror. Well, this young girl and her friends, the parents went off to go to town to go shopping, and they were going to stay overnight. So the girls decided to do this supper, and they laid out. They had antler type of silverware, servingware. They laid it out. They opened the windows. They had the lanterns. Very detailed description of this supper, this event, and they sat and waited. Well, at midnight, the wind came up. The lanterns blew out after they had, done everything they were supposed to do, and one of the girls screamed. And by the time they got the lanterns on, nothing really had happened, but they were missing a knife. Nobody knew where the knife went. Well, the girls were terrified. The parents came home. They were horrified. You didn't deal in witchcraft. So we go ahead about 10 years, and the young woman who was doing that was, she met somebody at the next town, and they got engaged. And according to the story, she was telling him one day about the foolishness of having a mute supper. And he turned to her and he said, "So you're the one who dragged me through hell." And he stabbed her. And what did he stab her with? The missing knife. She survived, but this was a story that was passed along in the Ozarks, in the town, by people who supposedly knew the family. So we see these really wonderful stories and legends that are embraced by the community, but also part of the fabric of the belief system of a community. Okay. This person deserves a book. I don't know if anyone has done a biography. Bill Newcomb, one of my favorite stories. Okay. what we called the Indian Wars, the Mexican Wars, the 1840s, when you had European settlers, American settlers, then moving west, coming into conflict, of course, with people whose land they just, took. It was dangerous, so they set up small forts along places like the Santa Fe Trail in order to make it safe for people to move to California, to Oregon, to Santa Fe. One of them is Fort Mann, which is in Kansas, near Fort Dodge. And so we're in the 1840s. It's St. Louis. A young man named Bill Newcomb signs up, is mustered into an army unit, and is sent out west with this unit. They took flatboats, they marched. This is the fort. You can see it was not a really comfortable place to live, especially in the winter. And this Bill Newcomb, did everything they were supposed to do as a soldier, until somewhere around the spring, it was discovered that Bill Newcomb was Elizabeth. She had been the girlfriend of the paramour of an army officer who convinced her to join as a man. And she served. She served for a good 8 months before they discovered she was pregnant. And of course, obviously, most of the men on the fort must have known what was going on. You can't imagine that in that kind of a close situation, people wouldn't know what was going on. So she was mustered out. The officer who had brought her along, he was thrown out of the military. And you would think, okay, that's the end of Elizabeth. Except she said, maybe about 15 years later, she moved to, I believe, Liberty. She married, and she came back to the government and said, you know what? I served my time. I want my retirement, my benefits. And it was the first time a woman had claimed benefits in court. And everybody, of course, thought this isn't going anywhere. And she stuck with it. And she was the first woman to receive military benefits for service in the military. And she did it as a male. And she's a legend I don't think anybody really knows of. And what an incredible story. The fact that she decided to join, she went with her lover. I mean, we're talking 1840s. This was an unusual time to be doing that. So Bill Newcomb, I believe she's buried towards Independence. I think her married name was Smith, which makes it a little difficult to track, as you can imagine. But her records of demanding pay for service still exist. Another great Missouri legend, we always associate these with Kansas, but in fact, in Colorado, the windwagons were built in Liberty and Independence at a couple of different workshops. What's a windwagon? The Chinese use them. They've been used for hundreds of years, essentially. As you can see, it is a wagon with a large sail, and it's a ship of the prairie. You get on it, you use it the way you would use a sailboat. Some of them were quite large. They were said to be, 15, 20 feet long. They could take 20, 30 men in it. And they would, the first person to work on one was, who built it in this country, was in Liberty. And he took it out to Kansas on the planes in order to try it. The first time they had a hard time maneuvering it. It flipped over, it broke, they repaired it. It took a couple of times to finally get it going. There's a story of one of them, and they were in use for several years. They did go back and forth. They were used to go back and forth to Colorado. There's a story of one being picked up by a tornado and flipped around and then dropped back down. Eventually, I think there's one wind wagon left. I believe it's in one of the museums towards Independence, I think. I'd have to check that. And one of the stories is that, you had wind wagons that took off and the men didn't know how to stop it, and they're still blowing across the prairie, and you'll run into their ghosts some days. But the wind wagon, I thought, was an absolutely fascinating story, made, built, tested in Missouri, taken over then there were several wind wagon builders who were known for their. In fact, you can see in the back there that larger wagon. Something that large is what they also used for wind wagons, but you have to then notice how much wind was there to move something that big across the prairies. It must have been an amazing sight. So we started the wind wagons, not Kansas. Another really great ghost story. Ghost stories and legends, people come up to me and they'll tell me their stories, and I listen, and they're wonderful, but we don't know what you may believe in ghosts, you may not believe in ghosts. Ghost stories tend to be things that reassure us either about another life or what we're doing in this one. They vary with religious and social and cultural beliefs. But we all kind of agree that a ghost is the spirit of someone who has passed and has come back. Sometimes they come back to warn you. Sometimes they come back for unfinished business. That's another one. In this case, Thespian Hall, for those of you who have been in Booneville, it was built in the 1850s. Wonderful old theater. Reminds me a little bit of the theater where Lincoln was shot, the same type of setup, Ford's Theater. So a woman, this is probably about 7 or 8 years now ago, had given a concert in Thespian Hall. And she was from Booneville, and it was a fundraiser, and everybody had left the hall. And her son-in-law went out on stage. She was in the back changing, and he took some photos of Thespian Hall. And they left. And a few days later, he sends his mother this photo and said, "Mom, I don't know who this woman is, but she wasn't there when I was taking the photo." Because you usually lock the front door and then you go out the side, as with many theaters. So she looked at this and she said, "Oh my gosh, that's my mother." And she said, "I really felt like she had passed away a few years earlier. And she said, I really felt like Mom was there that night." And this woman's telling me this story. And I said, "It's a lovely story. What can I tell you that, I don't know, does somebody wander in, somebody get locked in? I have no idea. But, I listened, and it's great. And obviously it showed us that maybe this woman wanted to think her mother was still there. Okay. A few weeks after that, I'm talking to someone else in town, and they asked me how the research was going. And I took out this photo and I said, "This is an interesting story." And the woman looked at the photo before I said anything. She goes, "Oh, that's Mrs. So-and-so." And it was. And I said, "Well, how do you know that?" And she goes, "Oh, yeah." She said it was her first husband's mother-in-law, and they would go down and play cards with her once a week or such. So for me, that was fascinating, because here I get this other person identifying who this woman is. And that's exactly who it was. I mean, out of all the people she could have identified, that's who it was. I don't know what the truth is behind this, but this is how ghost stories, how legends get started. Again, we know who the person was, where it happened, when it happened. Here's the question: whether it happened. So sometimes we get stories like this. Sometimes we get the Bill Newcombs, which we know are true stories, but they seem a little odd. They're different. We get Dr. McDowell, who was a grave robber. By the way, it was a felony to take jewelry from a corpse, but it was a misdemeanor to take the corpse. You go figure that one out. So our legends in Missouri keep changing, keep going. We have Willie the Little Stranger in Booneville. He was the character, that story was probably more popular in the early 20th century. His parents were vegetarians at a time when not a lot of people were vegetarians, from New York, who decided and heard about this new settlement in Kansas. And they traveled through. They went to Kansas. They get there. They had used all their money, and it turned out to be terrible. There were no houses. There was nothing. It was a scam. So they started to come back to try to get back to New York, get to Boonville. The father became very ill and passed away. And the son, about 2 days later, came down. It could have been cholera. Nobody's really sure of what it was. He died. The mother had nothing. So she went to one of the shops in town and asked if she could trade her clothes because she didn't have the money to bury the child. She had barely managed to bury her husband. Well, the town got, heard this and of course gave the boy, Willie, William, a burial. His grave is marked over in the city cemetery in Boonville. And he was marked down and listed as Willie, our little stranger. And the parents, the mother and the daughter, continued back. And that's one of the, it's a legend. But again, we know a lot about who these people were and why it happened. Myths and legends eventually get embroidered with stories, additions are made and whatever. And through the years, they're going to change and vary. But when you look at their heart, really, they're very much about survival, connections with other people, our culture, what we want from life, what's important to us. So those are some of the legends that I think kind of get short shrift here in Missouri. And are there any questions?
Feel free to type your questions into the chat. If you hover your mouse towards the bottom of your screen, you should see an option for chat, and that's where you will click to type those in.
And while you're doing that, a couple of the other very cool stories. Has anyone, well, again, I can't see a show of hands. There's a place down on the Kansas border called Liberal, Missouri. Little tiny town, little speck. Well, Liberal, Missouri was in the 1870s. It was started as a free thinkers colony. And essentially it was that it was atheism, it was spiritualism. There were no churches, there were lectures, and science ruled. Okay. You probably wouldn't even look at that today. The 1870s, it horrified not only the Missourians, but the Kansans, who couldn't believe that something as ungodly as this was on their border. Well, Liberal not only went, from the scientific point of view, but they brought in spiritualism. And it was home very much like a place called Lilydale in New York State, where spiritualists would flock every year and do readings and, counsel people and such. And this went on for a good 20 years. Liberal Missouri was either admired for its freedom or hated for the fact that it had, was disrupting what people considered a good life. And it all went along fine. There were some beautiful buildings there. I think there was Catalpa Park, which kind of still exists in the town. And then all of a sudden, the gentleman who was running Liberal Missouri had a change of heart and admitted and wrote a book called 30 Years Among the Spirits. And essentially what he did was he told how they had faked all of this spiritualism and how they faked, the ghosts and how they conned people out of their money. So, of course, within a year, the town almost ceased to exist. There is still a town called Liberal. But once again, that's a place that you would have found some more to the East Coast. And here it was in Missouri. And as I said, people were outraged, absolutely outraged that seances were going on. They were even more outraged when they found out that the ectoplasm was just cheesecloth and the cabinets that the medium would sit in had fake doors. and the hands floating in the air were just wax. But again, this shook many people's belief systems. And do we ever hear of liberal Missouri anymore? I don't think so. But so there we are. I think we've had a number of legends. Probably the most famous legend, again, without anybody, let me stop sharing here, without anybody being able to tell me anything. The most famous legend we have in Missouri, of course, is Jesse James. There is a good Jesse James ghost story, which I've never seen printed anywhere. I came across one source where Jesse, his band was riding back, and they came across a horseman who was all dressed in black, and essentially I think he was headless, if I remember the story. And everybody wanted to run, and Jesse said he knew who it was. And they never got him to talk about it, but he always believed that anytime there was going to be a tragedy in his life, he would see this horseman. So even Jesse James, who himself became a legend, believed in legends, and thought they had an impact on his life. And of course, our most famous legend, which we could spend hours on, of course, would be Mark Twain. So we won't spend hours on it. So any questions?
I had a comment from Vicky, and she just said that she loves the stories. So,
Well,
I agree.
thank you, Vicky. I do appreciate that. They're not my stories. I wish it's Vicky. I know Vicky. They're not my stories. I think the fun of collecting these is seeing them in the newspapers and seeing them in, books and rare, places where people don't record these. We don't record these because we're very often embarrassed. I saw a ghost. Am I going to write that to my uncle? Probably not today. Well, I guess maybe my uncle you would, but lots of other people wouldn't. So legends and tales, I think, are really important to keep. Unfortunately, today, with a lot of electronic stuff, we don't tend to, and things change quickly. Creepypasta has given us lots of legends that have become actually real. So it's a fascinating area, and I thank you so much for spending your time with me tonight. I wish I could see who you were, but introduce yourself to me if I run into you, okay? Anything else, Kat? Is there anything else I can do?
I don't think so. Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Thank you.
I
I have the legendary dogs in the other room trying to disrupt the entire thing. But there are lots of really excellent books out there. Check your library. There's a whole series of wonderful Missouri ghosts. There are lots of legends by I can't remember his first name, Botkin, Botkin, where he collected many, many stories from along the Mississippi and in this part of the country. Check them out and see what people believe, because it's quite a bit of fun. Well, thank you, Kat. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Hey.
So I just want to say again, thank you, Mary, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you learned something interesting. I know I did. So yeah, like Mary said, I know we have quite a few books in our collection. So feel free to get on our catalog and check those out, or come in and we can show you where they are on the shelf, all that great stuff. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and end it. Again, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Mary, for telling these tales.
Thank you. I wish it had been a dark and stormy night, but we did the best we could do in August. Thank you all again for being here. I appreciate it. And I hope to share more with you in the future. So take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.